Hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. I'm Luke Gilfeather, Executive Manager at EA Principles. Today's presentation is being given by Dr. Steve Else, Founder, CEO, Chief Architect, and Principal Trainer of EA Principles. EA Principles' leading consulting offering is to help organizations build or revitalize EA capabilities. EA Principles offers FEA certification training as well as Togaf and Archimate training. Steve Else has trained over 5,000 students in EA and Togaf. He has also trained thousands in Archimate 2.1 and Archimate 3 globally. Dr. Else served as the first Chief Enterprise Architect in the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for nearly 3 years and was in the PMO of the Health IT Department of the Department of Health and Human Services. He was a lead enterprise architect at the Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation and was a senior principal at the CSC's Federal Government Consulting Practice. Dr. Else did pioneering Internet of Things architecture work for BAE Systems in 2007 and overall EA and Togaf implementation at Fannie Mae. He also worked to roll out a Togaf-aligned EA program at the United Nations. Dr. Else helped establish service-oriented architecture at the Defense Logistics Agency. He was also formerly a career pilot in the U.S. Air Force and earned an airline transport rating to qualify to fly commercial airliners.
I'm Steve Else, and welcome to our talk on how to rapidly apply enterprise architecture to government transformation priorities. Now, you would think this would just simply say, welcome to the Federal Enterprise Architecture class, but in fact, there's a twist to this, and I'm going to explain this as we move along. Let me go to a mind map here to lay out a little bit of my script here. So the topic is one I think we can all identify with in the sense of enterprise architecture. If it's going to succeed, it needs to be done with agility, with speed, and in fact, one of our major challenges and opportunities right now is that enterprise architecture in the federal government is not getting the attention it deserves, even for such a challenge as government transformation. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, is pointing out shortfalls in capability daily and in major reports as well. But in releasing the shortfalls that it sees across government, it's not recommending architecture as an essential discipline. I think it's a pretty significant issue that we need to address, and maybe because EA is not being seen as essential upfront planning. So I want to address that from the GAO perspective and also from the Office of Management and Budget perspective, OMB. Recently, OMB mandated that all agencies provide inputs on how to modernize themselves to be more efficient and more effective. But nothing in the mandate, nothing in the memorandum mentions enterprise architecture or architecture at all. So clearly, enterprise architecture or the federal enterprise architecture discipline is not being recognized as instrumental for transformation. I think this can change by rethinking what it means to do architecture in the federal government, especially linked to the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform, FITARA, but also related to workforce transformation, which we'll address in this presentation. The purpose of this presentation is to make the case that EA and the federal government, in other words, the FEA, can be more rapidly applied to address the most pressing mandates for government transformation. I'm going to highlight some of this as I work through some slides here. The Office of Management and Budget has recently, again, requested that all agencies contribute to how they can transform themselves, working on reducing the federal civilian workforce. Now, I might point out that people who might be immediate targets for such reduction might be enterprise architects, right, as an attention getter, since architecture is not being really centrally focused on as essential for such major reform efforts. not just within an agency, but across the whole federal government. So here are some motivations for reform from the Office of Management and Budget. Citizen dissatisfaction with the cost and performance of the federal government. Focus has been on creating new programs instead of eliminating or reforming programs. Overlapping and outdated programs, rules, and processes. Keeping programs which no longer operate effectively. And too many federal employees stuck in a system that's not working for the American people. So that's right from the memorandum from OMB from March of this year. So they've taken some actions highlighted here to address motivations in terms of the workforce part, but we're also going to link this to the acquisition reform issues and overall transformation. And that ties a little bit with the March memorandum, the budget blueprint proposing eliminating funding for programs that are unnecessary, outdated, or not working, and also executive order asking for a comprehensive plan to reorganize the executive branch. So the agencies are all required to begin taking immediate actions to achieve near-term workforce reductions and cost savings. So it's not just workforce reductions, but also more efficiency, as focus more on performance. And yes, employee performance, but also overall performance for the agencies in terms of their scorecards. So this is tied to, of course, being OMB, tied to budget submissions. But we often find that the FEA is, in fact, tied to yearly budget issues and considerations. So this memorandum from mid-March of this year outlines steps to formulate a comprehensive government-wide reform plan leading up to the FY 2019 budget, both legislative proposals and admin ones. And agencies have been asked to submit their own ideas. OMB will coordinate across cross-cutting proposals, and the public has also been asked to input ideas on how to transform the government, agency-specific and cross the government. I might point out that that's something that EA Principles is doing, in fact, on the site from OMB, proposing the more aggressive use of enterprise architecture, in fact, to shine the light on what are the capabilities needed and where can we better enhance essential capabilities. So this ties to outcomes. Again, that one would think that architecture could be key to help reach the objectives listed here. Create a lean, accountable, more efficient government. Focus on effectively and efficiently delivering programs, meeting the highest needs of citizens. Align the workforce to meet the needs of today and the future rather than the requirements of the past, and remove barriers that hinder frontline employees from delivering results. So those are some of the outcomes for this transformation effort I wanted to highlight in terms of how we can bring enterprise architecture more into the discussion, and really must, or again, enterprise architects will be very vulnerable to have their positions removed as an efficiency measure. So in just over a month, agencies need to provide a high-level draft of their agency reform plan, and including near-term workforce reduction actions, and really focused on how they're going to measure employee performance. Now, again, this is a talk on enterprise architecture, so my point is that enterprise architects should be leading this discussion and should be seen as essential, in fact, to this planning. And with that in mind, they should, of course, be able to illustrate the value of their discipline, of their roles, and that's where I underscore, again, the need for enterprise architecture in the federal government to be agile and to be focused on the highest priorities and be able to communicate to the highest level of government regarding capabilities of the agencies overall and any particular programs within them. So some cross-cutting reform proposals here, looking across government, looking where certain services could be shared, where particular service might be handled by many different agencies in fragmented or duplicative ways, and looking at possibly merging agencies, components, programs, or activities that have similar missions. This is a very mega type of objective here, and it's a type of thing that's illustrating that enterprise architecture might be almost a footnote lost in the light of these major transformational efforts. But that said, enterprise architecture can be used in a very strategic way, as well as in a segment way or focused on a particular capability. So I think enterprise architecture has a major role to play in this, even though the Government Accountability Office and the Office of Management Budget haven't mentioned the word architecture at all in these documents that I'm highlighting for you here, which I think is of great concern. Should be of great concern to enterprise architects. So again, we have the tying it into the real world, looking at a budget a year from now, the 2019 budget that needs to be submitted in the fall of 2017. These type of inputs, but that need to be linked to discussions of capability, and that'll be one of my major themes as I move through my talk here. That we need to think of architecture in terms of enterprise architecture capabilities. So looking at these different drivers for transformation, again, I would like to see enterprise architecture play a bigger role in these types of activities, including performance tracking and accountability that you see here in terms of how's the government-wide reform plan doing. I would like to imagine that architects play a big role in that activity that you see here outlined, and mentioned that it would be tracked on performance.gov with periodic progress updates from agencies and oversight by the President's Management Council. And again, a big part of this would be tracking workforce reductions. But if workforce reductions are going to occur, they should be traced to where there is capability overlap rather than capability gaps, for example. So we need to have the discussion, we will, in terms of capability. So we're going to focus on workforce here as a major theme for a moment, and we're going to bring in architecture as a way to tackle that topic. So some of the points from the OMB memorandum: agencies could benefit from attracting and investing in a more holistic IT workforce that includes the right disciplines and effectively integrates contractors. So the government IT workforce would need to be viewed and managed in a blended way. But the government has struggled to hire key technologies such as cyber experts, network engineers, and software developers. So noting here a bit of a gap in capability, and perhaps a gap that could be better filled by working more closely with colleges and universities. Better integrate private sector talent into the IT workforce. So this is notably a little IT-centric, but keeping in mind that this whole workforce discussion is part of a bigger government transformation effort in terms of how do we transform the government to be more efficient and effective. So there's the assumption here that the workforce has some is a low-hanging fruit, you might say, in terms of where we could focus to get some efficiency, because of a lack of integration, because of a lack of shared services, and just overall cultural issues. So a lack of integration as well. So this would be a focused capability, would be the workforce in terms of bigger transformation topic. So that's why we're looking at it here briefly. So as part of the agency reform planning, agencies need to identify staffing plans that consider how to determine what are their required staffing levels to do what activities, to support what capabilities. So they need to be able to look at, and architects should be able to help answer this question: what does it take to meet the capability demands, the mission demands of the agency in different areas? So again, that alignment. What are the required activities, and where's the alignment of staff to those? And that again could also apply to enterprise architects as well. What value are they adding? So looking at long-term planning here in terms of assumed reduction in workforce numbers, review and revise organizational design and structures to maintain effectiveness, but to enhance efficiency while focused on capability, right? Focused on the mission. So making sure that nothing's falling through the cracks. So this is really quite an opportunity for architecture if architecture could get involved, and it would need to do so very aggressively here with some top-down support. There's almost the assumption, though, that architecture is not going to play a big role, which is what I find problematic here. So again, looking at the different mission areas in each agency, what services are provided, by whom, to what level of performance. These are the types of questions that are being focused on with this initiative. So here are some of the opportunities looking at shared services for database administration, invoice processing, HR, transactional services, financial management, and for management analysts, saying that, hey, we could share this type of staffing across agencies, and again, looking at how could we have a vision of better integration of private sector talent into the federal government. Some suggestions here in the memorandum from ONB. So other considerations here tied not just to the workforce, but pointing to issues in workforce capability and why we need better integration of talent and perhaps better architecture. You see here some of the legacy challenges that CIOs need to address. Use a more strategic approach for legacy system migration, migrate more services to the cloud, implement strategies to mitigate the impact on jobs when closing data centers. Now, clearly, these three items are really ripe for enterprise architecture. And so I'm pointing to these as examples of where architects should be laying out roadmaps, visions and roadmaps. So on the first topic, on the legacy system migration, CIO should take a strategic approach to replace outdated systems and also address more on the security aspects. The argument that legacy systems still work is not valid and must be addressed in terms of capability, what services need to be provided, what are the alternative, more modern ways to provide those, and also how do we dispose of the legacy systems. So that needs to be also architected. Moving more services to the cloud, so again, a big opportunity for architecture. Offer agencies a means to buy services faster and possibly cheaper by going to the cloud. And one department's move, for example, from data center to the cloud had allowed them to get out of the infrastructure business altogether. A department that worked with its CFO to acquire cloud services resulted in a bureau where almost everything has fully migrated to the cloud. So too many agencies are using security as an excuse not to move to the cloud, whereas CIA is already making the transition. Implement strategies to mitigate the impact on jobs when closing data centers. So again, having a vision that the transition could be made smoothly, and in light of the workforce disruptions. So this could be architected, right? If one had a vision of successful transformation in light of moving to the cloud, the workforce part of it needs to be planned carefully. And it has here, again, the idea that it's an acknowledgement that people will have to adjust to the changing environment. But there needs to be strategies, and these strategies need architecture. They need transition planning. So this also says it's not just about workforce, but it's also workforce efficiencies and performance, but it's also tied into the IT acquisition reform efforts that are getting a lot more visibility than enterprise architecture or the FEA, the Federal Enterprise Architecture Approach or discipline. So FITARA, we're going to hit on a little bit more as we go through here. But some actions there that we can consider here are to convey IT and cyber issues early to leadership, encourage more focus on IT and security for leaders that come in. Of course, this is above the EA's pay grade, but some of the issues that OMB is highlighting here. And of course, pointing to the continuing role of the Government Accountability Office to point out issues and opportunities. So the IT issues, IT workforce issues, cyber issues, they're interrelated. The IT acquisition part, of course, is interrelated to the workforce and the cyber aspects. And all these things need an integrated approach, and I would argue this is where the FEA can mature, needs to mature rapidly to be able to get on board with these mandates and challenges. So again, IT management, IT acquisition, cybersecurity, very pressing issues here, and in fact, priorities that architects need to be on board with. So here's a timeline. It's still going to be a little bit difficult to read, but it is a timeline in the memorandum that highlights some immediate actions and some additional actions, but leading to the FY19 budget process. We're looking for a government-wide reform act, basically. So looking at cross-agency priority goals, reform proposals, human capital planning. So all these things strike me as being opportunities for the federal enterprise architecture to kind of be reborn, the approach to that. Now, my suggestion here is that there are some approaches, such as the Open Groups Architecture Framework, Togaf. It has a method, the architecture development method, and I'm using it as only an example because it's kind of method-centric that could help us see how could we, in fact, focus on capability and also on the vision of success in these different areas and gap analyses and road mapping in light of some of these top-down driven opportunities here. So key questions to help focus and accelerate EA planning. So I want to just, in the next few slides, emphasize the capability rather than reductions, right? So what are the capabilities that we're focused on as we look within an agency or across the federal government? So we can try to look at things very strategically in that regard in terms of what capability, what might be a shared service, for example. So what's a business capability or government capability? It describes what an organization does. It provides an understanding of the whole landscape and potential impacts across and opportunities across a landscape. In this case, when we're looking across the whole federal government, it's a very large landscape. But even within one agency, you know, what's the impact of workforce reduction, for example, as we move, or workforce reorientation as we move to the cloud from traditional data centers. So looking at things from a capability point of view can, I think, be very helpful, because what is the capability we're seeking tied to our mission areas, and how do we achieve it now versus how could we achieve it in a changing landscape? So we have to look at a vision realized by goals, supported by capability, tied to initiatives, of course, traceable to business requirements, captured by the outcomes, such as I mentioned earlier, that the Office of Management and Budget's looking for. How can we tackle these things incrementally? What resources are in play over what time period? So these are some of the elements I color-coded here by the motivation elements, the initiative elements, the capability elements, and the solution elements. So this is a capability meta model. I think as architects, we could help tie everything back to capability. So let's just talk again the capability. So if we're looking at, for example, workforce capability, we would identify the strategy involved. What are the capabilities inherent? We assess the capabilities. We do a gap analysis. We understand what is the impact of the gaps and how to address them with different solutions. And we would update a capability map in terms of what are all the elements of the services of the workforce, and significant improvements, minor enhancements, major enhancements, fully support these different. This is a breakdown of a case management type of capability there, just as an illustration in terms of whatever any particular workforce component would be working on. How would we onboard them, offboard them? What services do they provide, et cetera? So looking at things from a capability point of view. So we look at the TOGAF architecture development method, and tying this to capability, and tying it to the FEA, and tying it to the need for rapidly transforming the ability to do architecture. The TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework, its preliminary phase is one that could help resonate with the FEA, because it basically says what EA capability is required to tackle the next cycles of change, whether it's IT acquisition, whether it's workforce realignment, what kind of EA capability do we need within an agency? What kind of EA capability do we need in the federal government to address such changes? So again, in this particular phase, we would say, what is our EA team and organization? How does our EA practice synchronize and harmonize with other frameworks and methodologies linked to our transformation and management decisions, including governance? Does our EA practice have EA principles, a customized method, use tools appropriate to its knowledge, skills, and maturity to meet its requirements? So I would say that right now there's a lot of should be a lot of concern about the current status of federal enterprise architecture and its lack of visibility in terms of the types of mandates that we're seeing that says we need to fundamentally change how we do business in government and across government. So this is a very timely question. One can't solve it across the whole federal government, but one can tackle it at least initiative by initiative in terms of how can we look at within an agency what would be the effective scope of what an agency is required to do overall or tied to particular mandates such as moving to the cloud. So let's say that we had a vision in this phase A of the ADM. So I have a little schema here where the preliminary phase says what is our capability to scope change here, to tackle scope change. And that's phase A here. We're talking about the architecture vision. So in phase A, what's the optimum scope in terms of any change that we want to be involved with, considerations of how any change would impact the whole landscape of capability. So what measurable valued business outcomes will come from the execution of an EA cycle, and what would be the key performance indicators? What would success look like if we did have better IT acquisition reform, better workforce realignment, better budget planning, better shared services? So we start tying those types of initiatives to visions of cycles of change, whether within a particular agency or across agencies. And then in that scoping, have we considered our capability to do the cycle successfully, including interoperability, readiness, and risk considerations? Is the scope traceable to business requirements linked to new or evolving business capabilities? And is the scope aligned to our principles? And would more elaborate principles for the scope be advised, such as we want to move to the cloud, but what would be some of the cloud principles? We want shared services, but what are some of the principles that would support shared services? So this is something I think that could really help the FEA in terms of having more repeatable method, kind of a maturation of the collaborative planning method that's on the books, the CPM, but that's not been mandated or actually very elaborative set up to be elaborate enough for action, for use, for practical use. But these questions here would tie to how would we scope change, bringing architects more into the whole discussion of the valued newer enhanced capability. Again, and the ripple effect of some of the mandates that I've already discussed here. So as we move to phases on the right of the domain architectures, basically business architecture, data application, and technology architecture, what would be the ripple effects across these in light of meeting the vision of better shared services, of more efficiency, of more effectiveness, of greatly reduced workforce in certain areas tied to modernization opportunities, et cetera? We need to look at things across different domains and in light of each other. So what are the gaps between the needed target capability and the baseline one from the different domains? What are the candidate options for fulfilling these gaps in capability, such as tied to workforce or tied to cloud platform or tied to automated apps? How can we best describe and share our analyses of the gaps and suggested candidates to satisfy the gaps to move us to the target from different perspectives to reach our vision of more efficiency, more effectiveness, more innovation in a modernized landscape? And then what are the roadmaps that we could have, such as I pointed out, the transition planning, the need for transition planning? What are our choices? What are the alternatives? And how could we analyze those different alternatives, those different work packages to take us from our baseline to our baseline to our target to satisfy the gaps outlined or elaborated by requirements? to get us to our vision. So, for example, what is our overarching strategy to move forward, including whether to outsource any of the work, to use the cloud or internal data centers, right? So that ties to the outline I've provided up front. So what kind of contracting mechanisms would be most appropriate? And this would tie to what workforce would we use, private sector, public sector, a hybrid of that, in terms of meeting the requirements to get to our vision. So in Togaf, the architecture development method, it takes us from an initial roadmap in the phase E to a final roadmap in phase F. Take into consideration all the work packages, the programs, the project, the tasks, et cetera, and their appropriate sequencing to get to our vision, get to our architecture vision. And then we have the very important aspect of governance. How are we going to govern all of our investments in change to get to our new vision? How are we going to perform compliance reviews? How are we going to decide what waivers to provide and how to manage the waivers? How are we going to coordinate with DevOps in light of where our vision is architecturally with what's happening operational as we move to operational implementation? So some of the aspects from the Open Group Architecture Framework to help put this into perspective. And also we can see with phase H, is our EA capability meeting expectations? Is it realizing value? How well are we managing change, risk, and governance? So these are the key questions that come out of the architecture development method in the Open Group Architecture Framework. I think would blend very well with the FEA, since the FEA ends up being largely tied to reporting, tied to funding each year. This is something that ties more to capability. So it forces us to address capability questions in light of mandates to reduce workforce or to move to the cloud, constantly say what is the new or the mandated capability, and what are the valid business requirements that we can trace to every action along the line. So that's the overarching part, understanding the mandates that we have for change. Then we also have wanted to point out a couple quick things in terms of how we can aggressively get the architects more involved with not just thinking through our methods, but also thinking through capability and getting through capability and helping to communicate change. So what I've opened up here is a tool called Archie, which is an EA modeling tool that is very, very useful for talking about capability and talking about road mapping. For example, we're going to just talk very briefly about the topic of capability, and then what resources do we need to assign to the capability in order to reach our outcome. So this is just to correlate with my discussion here of the mandates and how we could use a method to have the discussion of what resources do we need for the capability for our agencies, different capabilities, and what are our courses of action or our plans to satisfy that newer enhanced capability, and how would we measure that capability? So we do have through basic modeling tool like Archie, using the language of Archimate, we have the ability to say, okay, what does success look like? What course of action for what outcome? And then over time, like we're moving from baseline to target, this would be our baseline. We're moving from our baseline to our target. What are the gaps that we need to satisfy? So just a really quick illustration of that, moving from baseline to target, in terms of my capability discussion, what gaps do I need to fill? And what work packages am I going to need? What projects or programs am I going to need to meet my gaps, to satisfy those gaps? And then ultimately, what deliverables do I need to do to get to my target? So if I put this in to the context of EA capability to better integrate with the different funding mandates and OMB requirements and so forth, how do I show success as I move over time? Like it says, for example, by June 30th, the agencies need to submit their ideas for what kind of gaps they could resolve with what kind of work packages, and what are some of the activities that they could do. So this is very valuable, I think, for architects to understand, all architects and business analysts and program managers to understand, be able to talk about capability and talk about changing capability over time in terms of what gaps they need to be satisfying in order to meet the report requirements and so forth that come out of, for example, Office of Management and Budget. We talked about the IT acquisition. We talked about workforce. We talked about total agency transformation. How would I have a repeatable approach? And so this is using the combination of the open group architecture development method plus the Archimate language. We can see how we could address the FEA scenario, because we have to address scoping for change. So what are the issues in context, right? Who are the stakeholders? What are the drivers or concerns? What's our assessment, such as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the change for workforce reduction or for moving to the cloud or for shared services? So we tackle each of these things in a repeatable way, saying what are the goals and how significant are they? Are they critical goals? Are they less critical? So understand the goals, understand outcomes, understand our options to tackle our outcomes to get to our goals, to get back to our stakeholders' concerns. In this case, there's clearly stakeholder concerns for more efficiency in government and more effectiveness and better balancing of the workforce types of issues that we pointed out. All very recent material coming out from the Government Accountability Office and OMB. And again, architecture not mentioned a single time. We're saying, hey, we could architect this. Each of those elements, each of those challenges we could architect. We could come up with principles. We could address things from a capability perspective. Again, what resources do we need to assign to the capability in order to draft the vision, in order to pursue the vision with different courses of action? Again, what requirements and constraints can we capture? What gaps do we need to satisfy with what work packages? So that takes us back to our overarching discussion here of how to rapidly apply enterprise architecture to government transformation priorities. My point is that, sadly, as we've gotten these mandates to comprehensively reform the federal government, architecture is not even mentioned in any of those documents. And in the daily Government Accountability Office reports, again, architecture is never mentioned as something that should be pursued to tackle the concerns brought up in these different daily reports from the Government Accountability Office. So I think we're at a real inflection point with the federal enterprise architecture, where we're going to have to not only change, but we're going to have to change rapidly. And we have opportunity to do that in terms of these near-term mandates, near term, but then over the next few months, in terms of how can the government show that it's more capability focused. And again, there is the opportunity there. I've been talking with CIOs across the federal government, and I've told that, unfortunately, in many cases, EA has been given kind of a back seat, and the focus is on the FITARA, the IT acquisition dashboards, and on basically these reports for budget submission. This is the direction, and a lot of people are not even filling their EA billets right now. Other people are, and I see lots of advertisements for some agencies. Other agencies are not even filling their billets for EA. And I also could point out to you that a lot of times it's been a while since there have been any EA scorecards in terms of how are people doing EA. But I think that we're really at a delicate point. There's huge opportunity for EA with this idea of really big changes. But if EA doesn't get on board, then some of the people who are going to be most vulnerable to be cut will be the enterprise architects. Okay, I'll just do a quick summary. My summary was that enterprise architecture is right now in the federal government, it's being seen as not being perceived as essential for the types of changes, given the fact that we need major input rapidly on very significant issues regarding shared services, regarding even justifying one's continuing capabilities. And so architecture has an opportunity, though. It's going to take work. It's going to take the CIOs and the CIO Council, getting more on board with this, of course. But those who are enterprise architects in the federal government who are supporting enterprise architecture initiatives, I think that the attitude has to be more on how can we help this discussion of capability in a repeatable way with visioning, with gap analyses, with road mapping, always tied to, again, what are the key capabilities and what are some that maybe are not so key. So prioritization. And so I just did a little benchmarking with the Open Group Architecture Framework in terms of its method for planning, which is more mature than the collaborative planning methodology that we cover in our FEA classes. But people usually benefit from also looking at the Togaf's ADM. That is more elaborate than the CPM, the collaborative planning method, and the FEA common approach. But also looking at big picture things like reference models, reference architectures, and looking at modeling. So when we train architects, we teach them how to basically model enterprise architecture, from the capability part to the road mapping part to the governance aspects, but very rapidly cover that in 1 week class where they look at the FEA challenges, but also look at how to scope initiatives and how to model them, how to communicate them. So that's what we've seen across the world. I've taught enterprise architecture to governments around the world, and again, as I mentioned, United Nations and so forth. But the Open Group Architecture Framework with its architecture development method, plus more recently the Archimate language, have been very popular. The ADM method has to be customized to each organization, of course, but the language of Archimate, what it's emphasizing is the value of standards for more efficient analysis for any architectural change. So Archimate is something well worth learning, and we just orient people to that in our FEA classes so that they have a tool right away, and a language that they can talk about capability and change, and visioning of it, the road mapping of it, all in a compressed time, because people need to rapidly accelerate their knowledge, skills, and maturity in enterprise architecture to be more perceived as more valuable in the federal space. Are there any questions at all?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about the application of the Togaf framework for the upcoming deliverables, the one in June, which is the draft of the proposals, and then the one in September, which is the final plan. Would you see streamlining that process to get things done in the required time frame, particularly for organizations that may not have a clear definition of their corporate capabilities already?
Well, I think that the key part it does ask you very specific things about the workforce and also more general things about transformation. My point here is that one can streamline the method. This from a recent class with one of the national laboratories. We discussed how you could in fact boil the Togaf ADM down to its essence, and that's this part here, is that what capability do we need? Again, this is the EA capability in this case. So what EA capability do we have now versus what do we need to help on this? So your question would say, well, maybe we don't have the EA capability that we need, or maybe we can't. Yeah, go ahead.
My thought would be that you could, if what you're doing as you go through this is identifying gaps, or one of the things you try to identify is where there may be redundancy.
Right.
Is a way outside of EA, if we're not looking at EA as a capability, let's say we're looking at grants management as a capability.
Right.
And looking for opportunities for proposals in there, either from we've got redundancy and duplication, or we have a gap that we're not actually providing. So is there a way to I'd be interested in how you might streamline this model to at least conceptually organize the framework when you're presenting your proposals to OMB.
Right. Well, the way that I'm proposing to them on their website is, in fact, this idea of what's been weak in government architecture for a long time is the ability to scope, is the ability to articulate any scoped effort. So I think that's the value, is that in a phase A, and assuming that there is some EA capability, you want to say, what does success look like? So you're talking about, again, what would be the outcomes tied to what they're going to be tracking on the performance.gov and so forth. What are the outcomes that would illustrate success in a reduced or realigned workforce, or combination of moving to the cloud plus sharing services like grants management, any of the above. So what would be the ways that we're going to deal with or define that success? What does success look like? And look at it in terms of, again, how you'd measure it, but also how is it going to interoperate? Are we really ready for that change? Just like they said, are we ready for having people suddenly leaving the data centers? Are we ready to plan, their transition planning? And then look at things from the risk perspective, and we could throw in there, of course, the security perspective. So my bottom line to you is the ability to scope and keep iterating the scope. So one of the things that this is one of the hardest things to do, but it's the ability to do the workshops, the scenario workshops, to do better scoping for your different initiatives. I think that's the key thing. And then once you have the right scope, then the gap analyses are you're looking at things from different perspectives in terms of gaps, overlaps, in order to say what are ultimately the work packages that we need, in what sequence do we need them. But it comes back to your ability to do this. One suggestion I made to folks is tied to design thinking. And it's something that, again, tied to workshops, scenario workshops. That don't have to take a lot of time. But you go in and say, okay, what's our current situation? Okay, what if we could improve it somewhat? What would that look like? Okay, what if we could hit a home run? So what if, what wows? What if we could hit a home run? What would that look like? And you can say, okay, given our constraints, so we need something by June, and we need something by September, or what have you, what works? So what is, what if, what wows, what works? So iteration with a scenario type of thing tied to the modeling, as I illustrated to you, that you could then say, in each modeling, who are the stakeholders? What are their concerns? And this is another aspect of bringing in the modeling, but tied to any initiative, who are the stakeholders? What are their concerns? Let's really analyze their concerns, and let's come up with goals then tied to outcomes, tied to courses of action that are going to be dependent on having certain principles and certain capabilities. So we have, my point is that the repeatable emphasis on scope, and with a standard language, with that map that I pointed out to you, I really think that is extremely valuable, and I've run this across, with people in the government and outside the government. But it's a repeatable approach. So I hope that helps a little bit. The scoping's critical. So if it's too big to bite off, then you have to scope it, iteratively to something that you can identify and answer these questions for it. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Are you going to share your slides and in particular this mind map, which would
of
be
course.
Really
I'm going to send it in the MindMeister is a free browser-based one, is why I'm showing this to you in MindMeister. So you'll be able to have it in its raw form and use it if you like. So it's a free software. So I am going to provide all the slides, and one of the things that I just want to, I'll summarize, is that the FEA, we've taught it for a long time. I've been certified in FEA for over 10 years. I've just found that a lot of times it's made too obscure, and it's not boiled down to how do we scope to move forward, like your question was, to move forward to solve some issues like right away. So people need an approach that's tied to best practice, leading practices across the world. And that's where I showed you the architecture development method, because every time I've taught the FEA folks, they say, well, this is actually pretty useful as long as you boil it down to its essence. It's the scoping, it's the gap analysis, it's the road mapping, it's the governance, right? But with certain taxonomy, once I give people this taxonomy, they go, gosh, I could use this for every workshop, answer these questions every time over and over again. And actually, the fact that you could actually model it is a real plus. But here I don't show you the iconography, But once you bring in the fact that you could actually model this, you could learn that in the course of 5 days, where you're starting to do electronic whiteboarding with reusable icons, it's very powerful for folks to say, well, we've been really kind of in the dark ages as architects. That's one reason the FEA hasn't moved out fast enough, because it's been too bureaucratic. There's not been the sense of urgency and the ability to really quickly create use cases and stories, right? Mm-hmm. To scope your work and explain, here's the vision, here are the gaps, here's the roadmap, so I find that it's very, that it takes a lot of energy. I'll just tell you that I just did a proposal for an organization that's actually a big nonprofit, but they had such a sense of urgency that it's like, how quickly can you get that to us? How quickly can we, so the government, they're really pushing hard with urgency, but notice they're not asking for architecture. They're kind of blowing it off. That's another one of my big themes, because I've been collecting hundreds of GAO reports over the last year, and they never recommend architecture. So it's like, what's gone wrong here? Why has architecture fallen so far out of favor? To me, it's essential architecture. I have an article on that on my website. EA stands for essential architecture. So you must learn to scope things so that people see, hey, this is vital, that we consider the stakeholders' concerns, requirements, principles, so every time, right? Are there any other questions? I'm sure I'm going to provide all this to you with a summary for anyone who requests it. Any other questions?
Hi, everybody. I'm Loriana. I'm a program executive with EA Principles. First of all, thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Steve, for providing this webinar. The first thing is we are going to send out an email recap and also a link to the video so you can view it later. The second thing is we do have upcoming FIF courses. One of them is online and the other one is in person. They have the same dates. The in-person one is in Washington, D.C. from June 12th through the 16th. The online one is the same dates. And I also put links to those in the chat window for the online course and the in-person one. And the second thing too related to that is we will provide a coupon for you guys just because you've attended the webinar today. So it's our thank you to you where you can get a discount.
All right. Well, thank you all, and let us know if we can help you in any way.